Greetings and thanks to Dora for inviting me to speak and for organizing another wonderful conference on the archaeology of Paros. To provide you with some background, although you already heard a little bit, the archaeological site of Koukounaries Hill is located on a limestone outcropping in the northwestern part of Paros, overlooking the Bay of Nausa. Excavations of the Mycenaean building on the hill summit were carried out under the direction of Dimitris for the Archaeological Society of Athens from 1976 to 1992. My own involvement with the site began in 1978 as a square supervisor while in graduate school. I'm so old. Anyhow, then in 1982, I studied a deposit of pottery for one season, and then I was invited to return in 1996 to continue my study, which I did for several years with a group of students from Hunter College. The building itself is an elaborate version of a Mycenaean corridor house. However, rather than having a single transverse corridor, it has two intersecting corridors, one running east-west and one running north-south. The building was laid out with a Cyclado-Cyclopean wall on the south face, with 3 storerooms attached to its inner face, casemate style. The building's main entrance is on the west, which led to a staircase that provided access to an upper floor. Another staircase was built into a cleft in the north face of the hill, which led down to the source of fresh water. And a small shrine was placed just inside the north entrance. In my volume on the Mycenaean pottery, published in 2021, I divided the life of the settlement into 4 episodes based on its stratigraphy and its architectural history. Thus, the site was founded and occupied in the late Helladic 3C develop phase, perhaps around 1175 to 1150. It was then destroyed at the start of late Helladic 3C advance, shortly after 1150. Small areas of the site were then briefly occupied in late Helladic 3C late, when the site was then abandoned until the 9th century. Perhaps what is most striking about the site is the unusually large number of well-preserved artifacts that were discovered, which is highly uncommon for a settlement. This is evident from the ceramics alone, with more than 150 intact vessels. And perhaps even more surprising are the nearly 125 intact bronze objects, which is odd, considering the fact that they come from an era after the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland, when access to copper and tin sources were rare. Shortly before his untimely death, Schilardi gave me permission to study and publish the portable Mycenaean finds from Koukounaries. Since the metal objects are presently being conserved in a laboratory on Andros, I turned this past June, a year ago, to my attention of the 2 carved ivory fragments which had fallen from an upper floor room that are on display in the Paros Museum. Dimitri recognized that the larger fragment belonged to the arm of a chair or throne, and that the second fragment may have had a carved rosette. Right from the outset, I thought that the outer face of the chair fragment was carved with a wing, and I thought that it might belong to a griffin. But I was perplexed by the other fragment until I turned it vertically and realized that it was carved with a nail from the claw of a talon. Based on both the vertical shape of the fragment and its anatomical feature, it seemed to me that this fragment came from the leg of the chair, and most likely the left leg. On the same day, I opened a small envelope in the museum storeroom, which was labeled ivories, and inside there were 3 ivory fragments. When I turned over the largest fragment, I saw that it was also carved with a nail from a talon. Indeed, both fragments with claws were carved identically from the back. It thus seemed to me that we now had the fragments from the chair's 2 front legs. While one of the other fragments in the envelope was a large burned flake, a third fragment preserved its smooth surface and part of a bronze nail. Since all the ivories came from the same context, it seemed likely that this piece also belonged to the chair, and thus demonstrated that the chair was made in pieces joined with bronze nails. This method of construction is alluded to in the Linear BTA series from Pylos, which describes various kinds of inlaid wood and ivory thrones. Prior to this discovery, there were no extant specimens of Mycenaean thrones. The stone throne from Knossos is the only example of a throne, and its date and function are still debated. The only Mycenaean image of a throne is the one depicted on the gold ring from Tiryns, although we also have the base of a throne, supposedly from a throne, also from Tiryns. Probably the closest parallel to the type of chair that I imagine here is a 12th century ivory plaque from Megiddo, carved with a depiction of a throne flanked by sphinxes. I therefore propose that the ivory fragments from the Koukounaries building came from a throne flanked by griffins, whose legs served as the legs of the chair, carved with a single claw on each side. Interestingly, the closest parallel for the shape of our wing occurs on an ivory plaque from the Artemisian deposit on Delos. Based on Iphigenia Tournavitu's recent examination of the pottery from the deposit, the large amount of late Helladic 3C developed sherds may suggest that this fragment is contemporary with the ivory chair from Koukounaries. The ivory plaque from Delos also shows that the fragment from Paros belongs to the inner smooth part of the griffin's wing, known as the covert. Another connection between the ivories from Paros and Delos is the beaded motif that outlines the wing from Paros and forms a base pattern on the ivory from Delos. These may be, in fact, the only known examples of this decorative pattern on ivory. What seems to be particularly relevant to have a throne flanked by griffins is the role played by griffins on the walls of the throne rooms at Knossos and Pylos, where they clearly function in a protective capacity for the inhabitant of the throne, the Wanaks. Yet the Koukounaries settlement was established at least one generation after the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland and the collapse of the Mycenaean system of government. However, scholars have recently come to recognize elements in the 12th century that reflect a memory of and nostalgia for this bygone palatial era. I think that the lyre player depicted on a kylix fragment from Koukounaries is an eloquent example of what I would call iconographic condensation, where the essential elements of an iconographic program were distilled and simplified. Thus, I would also regard the griffin throne as an example of iconographic condensation. As I noted in the title of my talk, I would now like to consider the circumstances that brought an end to the Mycenaean settlement on the Koukounaries hill. What we do know is that the site was burned and covered with a thick layer of ash. When pressed to explain its violent ending, Scolari suggested that the site was destroyed in a siege, waged perhaps by the inhabitants of Naxos. While this is an attractive theory, especially since Naxos appears to thrive in the area after the Koukounaries destruction, it is odd that so many bronzes were left and not retrieved, considering how rare bronze was in 12th century Greece. Therefore, Andreas Vlachopoulos suggested that the site was destroyed in an earthquake. And it does appear from the toppled walls that the site was hit by an earthquake, but one that dates to the 8th century BCE. However, the walls of the Mycenaean settlement were not toppled. Furthermore, if it were an earthquake that destroyed the site, one would expect that the inhabitants would have returned to retrieve their valuables. Nor is it clear that an earthquake would have resulted in a fire that blanketed the site in a thick layer of ash. During my study of the Mycenaean pottery, my colleague Jeremy Rudder urged me to look into the possible sources of inspiration for the shapes and motifs. Indeed, it appeared that the likeliest candidates were Attica and Viotia. I therefore proposed that the Koukounaries settlement was founded as a joint venture with a group from Attica and a group from Boeotia. What I think is important to acknowledge is that the collapse of the Mycenaean palatial system with the Wanaks or its king at the head stimulated experiments in new forms of government. We can point to the establishment of dual kingship in Sparta as one example. What I would like to propose here is that the two groups which founded the site agreed to a system of alternating kingship, 1 year Attica, 1 year Boeotia. And as is reflected in the play The Antigone, one inhabitant of the Griffin throne refused to give up power, which then provoked a civil war. And as is common in civil wars, neither side was victorious. Thus, the symbol of their experiment in alternating kingship, the ivory griffin throne, was destroyed in an act of political iconoclasm. The settlement was set ablaze, and the site was abandoned for the next several centuries. Thank you for your attention.